Welcome to What's the Scenario with PLRB, where we explore claims and coverage scenarios relevant to insurance professionals. I'm Alicia Watley.
I'm Mike Brode.
I'm Tim Havler.
And I'm Brennan McLaughlin.
Hey Brennan, what's the scenario?
Isn't it Tim's turn to do a scenario?
Wait a minute, I thought it was Mike's turn.
Oh, hold on here now. Alicia, don't you have anything to talk about?
I never come with a scenario. I don't know what you're talking about. But, we've done so many of these. Let's just play another one.
A replay, a best of. That will be very exciting.
For the next 2 weeks over the holidays, we're going to feature some excellent podcasts from before we rebranded as What's the Scenario with PLRB. These segments were called the Coverage Contrarian, and they featured PLRB coverage attorneys Michele Hunter, Eric Friedmann, and Frank Gagliardi as they've argued vociferously about coverage issues big and small. This week, we'll explore the scenario of an insured repair business that repaired a valve on a large boat so poorly that the whole engine was damaged. Let's listen in.
Hello, my name is Michele Slupinski, Casualty Services Counsel with PLRB. And also with me today is my co-presenter, Frank Gagliardi, Casualty Services Counsel with PLRB as well. Say hello, please, Frank.
Hello, please, Frank. Sorry, couldn't resist.
Today, we are going to be discussing the issue of workmanship coverage issues that arise from engine servicing. Now, this area gets tricky when an insured is performing engine work or an overhaul. So the threshold question is, was the area damaged, as in the area that the insured was working on? In general, if the damaged area or parts or property were an integral part of the insured's work endeavor, then coverage would be excluded. However, if the insured's work or work product had no connection with the damaged area or parts, then coverage should be available because it was not encompassed within the insured's own controllable business risk. In other words, what we want to know is, did the damage arise in an area where the insured was working or performing operations?
That's right, Michele. For those of you who handle construction defect claims across the country know, there are a number of states where a claim that is limited to the repair or replacement of the insured's faulty work product does not constitute an accident or an occurrence. In these states, a claim that is limited to the repair or replacement of faulty work means that no liability coverage would be provided by a CGL policy because there's no occurrence. There's no need to consider the application of any exclusions because the coverage provided by the policy has not been triggered in these jurisdictions. I believe this principle should be kept in mind when considering the availability of coverage in the types of cases that we're going to be discussing today.
Right, and let's just jump right in to our first scenario. So for this scenario, let's assume that an insured repair business performed engine work on a large boat engine. And the facts are that the insured's contracted work encompassed only a valve job on both of the engine heads. The contracted work did not involve any work on the main engine block per se, but later the engine failed because several valves stuck, and this caused damage to the main engine block, the pistons, cylinders, and the crankshaft. And this is important. This ensuing engine damage arose from the insured's faulty valve overhaul work when an improperly installed valve fell into the engine internals. So the question becomes, is there coverage for damage to the engine block, pistons, etc., and tear-out costs or other property unrelated to the insured's valve job overhaul? And we believe the majority position answer to this question is yes. Liability coverage would be allowed for any resulting damage to the engine block, pistons, etc., and tear-out costs, assuming these areas were unrelated to the insured's contracted work.
I guess this is what makes me the coverage contrarian, because the correct answer here is clearly no. All the items that were damaged are part of the engine the insured worked upon. In the states where repair or replacement of faulty work is not an occurrence, I believe this claim would not even trigger coverage under a CGL policy. End of story.
Wait, So you don't view the damage to other parts of the engine as being separate property from the insured's contracted work on the valves that he was hired to replace?
No, how can they be? They're all part of the same engine. I mean, look at it this way. If done incorrectly, the insured's work on the valves is going to cause damage to the cylinders and the pistons and the other items that you mentioned because they're all part of a working whole. There's nothing accidental about this result. If the damage is limited solely to the engine, then I believe the claim is one for the repair or replacement of faulty work that would not be covered by a CGL policy under the laws of these states.
But what about in the other states that do consider faulty work to be an occurrence that triggers liability coverage under a CGL policy? In those states, would there be liability coverage for the damage done to the engine?
No. In those states, I believe that the damage to your work exclusion would apply to deny coverage for any damage done to the engine.
Okay, Frank. Well, let me just say under the majority view of the exclusion, coverage is only denied for damage to the insured's own work effort. So the critical question is, what was the insured hired to do? Or what area was the insured contracted to work upon? What this means is that coverage would be available for damage to adjoining or adjacent property or material that the insured was not working directly upon. So I'm sure you would agree in our scenario, Frank, shouldn't there be coverage for the other parts of the engine that got damaged due to the insured's faulty work on the valves?
But let's not forget, Michelle, that the damage to your work exclusion is often referred to as a business risk exclusion in order to emphasize that there's no intent to guarantee for the quality or fitness of the insured's work effort. I mean, I can't count the number of cases from all across the country where the courts say the CGL policy is not intended to be a performance bond. In other words, the insured is presumed to be competent in his chosen field of work. Applying this understanding of the exclusion, since the insured had to work on the whole engine in question, then any damage to the engine would be excluded, right? I believe there's some authority to that effect.
Yes, but only a few jurisdictions. A minority across the country would exclude all of the resulting damage in question. But to your point, Frank, probably the best example of this minority view is the case of Barbie versus Hartford Mutual Insurance Company, which is a North Carolina Supreme Court case from 1991. And in that case, the court did hold that the exclusion for faulty work you performed precluded coverage for damage caused when a repair shop operator's employee accidentally dropped a foreign object through the spark plug opening and into the engine cylinder. So when the auto was later driven, the foreign object ended up damaging the cylinder. And the court did say that the damage was due to the insured's negligent performance of business tasks and that liability insurance policies were not intended to be performance bonds and coverage.
What did I tell you?
But, well, and then there is another minority view case. And again, this is a Mississippi Supreme Court case from 1965, State Auto Insurance Company versus Glover. In that case, a customer left an auto at a garage for the repair of its carburetor. And but when the insured removed and rebuilt the carburetor, a piece of metal fell into the intake manifold. And the court there found that coverage was not available for the resulting damage because of the faulty work exclusion. And the court stated that, again, just like the other case above that I was talking about, the garage keeper's liability policy was not intended to cover damages occurring to a customer's auto as a result of a mechanic's error or mistake.
Well, that's why both of those cases were correctly decided, in my view.
Not true, Frank, I think. And most other sources of authority would agree the better majority position is to exclude coverage only for that portion of the insured's contracted work.
Well, wait a second. Aren't you turning the policy into a performance bond under that reasoning?
No, because there's no coverage for the insured's actual faulty work on the valves.
But that's way too generous a view of the coverage intended to be provided by the CGL. Here you're rewarding the insured for doing a poor job. He had to take apart the engine in order to replace the valves, if the engine gets damaged because he didn't put it back correctly, that's a business risk. That should not be covered by the CGL because of the damage to your work exclusion.
No, not at all. I think, Frank, what you're getting hung up on is what constitutes an insured's own contracted work. And that's making you limit the scope of protection provided by a CGL policy. Again, under the majority view, coverage is expressly intended for unrelated third-party property damage.
You know, I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying that in the case of an engine repair or overhaul work, the insured is working on the whole engine, and any damage to it should be excluded from coverage.
Well, no. Remember here that the insured was not hired or contracted to work on the entire engine.
How can he not be working on the entire engine when he's taking the head covers on and off to do the repair?
Again, that's because the insured was not hired to repair or work on all parts of this motor in our scenario.
I'm not buying that broad coverage interpretation. He's working on the whole engine, in my view.
Okay, Frank. Let's agree that there's a majority and a minority view involved here. And let's move on to scenario number 2. In our second scenario, the insured performed a preventative maintenance oil change, but the insured failed to adequately tighten the oil drain plug, and this caused all of the installed oil to leak out. So according to the insured, this was a routine oil change performed every 6 months, and there must have been a mistake in the drain plug tightening process. So what happened there is the engine completely seized and the entire engine had to be replaced.
You know, this is no different than the first scenario, and therefore there should be no CGL coverage provided for the reasons we've already discussed.
Really? Frank, you honestly believe there's no coverage for the damage done to parts of the engine that were not directly worked upon by the insured in order to perform this oil change? The problem with your view is it represents an overly broad scope of the contracted work done by the insured in these types of cases. Again, the critical inquiry in a defective or faulty workmanship case is the scope of the insured's agreed upon contracted work. Here, based on the facts that we have, the scope of the insured's work was performing routine maintenance in the form of an oil filter change. And the insured's improper performance of reinstalling the drain plug apparently caused the engine to fail, and then the whole engine had to be replaced. And under the majority view, the damage to the engine would be considered damage to other property because the insured was not hired to work on the whole engine itself, actually just the opposite. So assuming that the insured was hired only to perform an oil filter change and nothing more, the engine would be considered beyond the scope of the insured's work.
You know, okay, but when I ask myself what the scope of the work in this case was, the answer I get is that the insured's faulty work on the engine caused it to fail.
I disagree.
You know, if you think the damage to the engine is somehow beyond the scope of the insured's work so as to be covered, how about we tweak the scenario a little bit?
How so?
Okay, let's assume that for whatever reason, the damage to the engine occurs while the vehicle is still in the insured's custody, all right?
Okay, but why do you think that would make a difference to the coverage provided under a CGL policy?
Do you think that the damage to property exclusion, J6, would apply to the damage done to the engine? And now, for those of you who don't have the standard CGL policy committed to memory, the J6 exclusion denies coverage for damage to property because the insured's work, and I'm quoting here, was incorrectly performed on it, unquote. My question is, what is the it that the insured is working upon while performing an oil change?
Well, Frank, you're changing the factual scenario here a bit. We were originally talking about an engine that seized after a completed operation where the car left the insured's business premises. We're not talking about a J4 care, custody, or control fact pattern in our scenario.
You know, you can't tweak something without changing the facts a little, Michelle. But But let's put a pin in the care, custody, and control exclusion, because that would create another interesting debate on the application of that exclusion in such cases, and instead limit ourselves to the J6 exclusion.
All right, so for purposes of the J6 exclusion, we need to think about what work the insured was hired to perform, and then also ask what part of that contracted work actually caused the damage in question.
I'm with you so far.
So in our case, in our scenario, the insured was hired to do only 3 things. 1, drain the oil. 2, replace the filter. And 3, reinstall the drain plug correctly. The insured was not hired to touch or work directly upon the rest of the engine as a controllable business risk. So if anything is excluded under, again, the majority view, it would only be the cost of the loose drain plug and, of course, the oil, because the insured had his hands on that, and tightening the drain plug was part of the insured's contracted work.
That's what makes the majority view completely wrong in such cases. While an oil change involves nowhere near the amount of intrusive work on an engine as the valve job in the first scenario, the fact remains that the insured is working on the engine as a whole in both cases.
Again, the insured was only hired to drain the old oil and pour in new oil, and that's it, nothing else.
Yeah, I believe that represents way too limited an understanding of the importance of an oil change. The oil that the insured pours into the engine lubricates every moving part. If there's no oil, the entire engine will quickly cease working. You know, how could he not be working on the whole motor here when the oil is needed for its proper working? But in any case, I think that most people would agree that the engine is the it that the insured was working upon, and that any damage to the engine would be excluded because the insured's work was, quote, incorrectly performed on it, end quote, to trigger the J6 exclusion. And if the damage to the engine would be excluded by the J6 exclusion while the work is ongoing, it stands to reason that the same damage would be excluded by the damage to your work exclusion that applies to completed operation. Pretty nice legal reasoning there, if I do say so myself.
No, Frank, that is actually a different factual scenario and not the completed operation that we started out with. Okay, but clearly there's a debate when we consider the majority and minority positions on this issue, and I have to admit you presented a somewhat coherent legal argument, at least in support of your view.
Well, that's an awfully big admission for you to make, so I'm going to take it and consider my work here done.
Not so fast. Let me ask you this. Are there any engine repair jobs, any, where damage to the engine would be covered by the CGL policy, in your opinion, Frank?
Well, you know, in preparing for our conversation today, I did come up with an example where even I could see both sides and think it may be a disputed question of fact that the jury would have to decide if the exclusion applies or not.
And what was it?
Instead of an oil change, the insured's work is to replace the radiator.
Okay.
Now, unlike the first two examples where the insured is working directly upon the engine, we can all agree that the radiator is a separate item from the engine block.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, so for purposes of the J6 exclusion, the radiator could be the it that would be excluded from coverage, which means the damage to your work exclusion would not apply to the subsequent damage done to the engine that was caused by the failure of the radiator.
Exactly. I believe that would be the correct result under the majority view.
Then once again, the majority view is rewarding the insured for doing poor work and providing liability coverage for the repair or replacement of that faulty work.
That's nonsense. The majority view simply provides the insured with the greatest amount of coverage that is permitted by the policy language itself.
A little too much in my view.
How so?
We can all agree that the purpose of the radiator is to prevent the engine from overheating. Even though they're physically separate items, the radiator is still connected to the engine block by the hoses through which the radiator of the antifreeze mixture from the engine circulates to be cooled. So when the insured replaces the radiator, he's also working on the engine block because any faulty work done to the radiator will cause damage to the engine block from overheating. You know, just as the oil lubricates every moving part, a functioning radiator is the means by which every moving part of the engine block is cooled to allow for its continued operation. This is, for me, enough to make any damage to the engine not covered by the CGL policy, but like I said, I can see why the majority view might prevail in such a case, although wrongly, of course.
Well, there you have it. The minority opinion, and I will emphasize a minority opinion of the Coverage Contrarian. That's all we have time for today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. Until the next episode of the Coverage Contrarian, if you could say goodbye, please, Frank.
Of course. Goodbye, please, Frank.
So, Brennan, what can we take away from this scenario?
The critical inquiry in a defective or faulty workmanship case is the scope of the insured's agreed-upon contracted work. Under the majority view, the damage to the engine would likely be considered damage to other property because the insured was not hired to work on the whole engine itself. Under the minority view, working on an interconnected part of the engine will be considered working on the engine as a whole.
Mike, where can an adjuster go to learn more?
That's a fantastic question, Tim. I think folks could always go out to plrb.org, check under the education section. For a full back catalog of all of our podcasts, most of which include references to related articles, webinars, and other resources. Hey, Alicia, can we share those in the links in the show notes?
Yes. And there you'll be able to find a recap of the key points from this episode, links to our social media, and information on how to submit your own adjuster story. No, don't forget to subscribe and rate us, and we'll see you all next time.
See you next time.
Bye, everybody.
The views and opinions expressed in this resource are those of the individual speaker and not necessarily those of the Property and Liability Resource Bureau, its membership, or any organization with which the presenter is employed or affiliated. The information, ideas, and opinions are presented as information only and not as legal advice or offers of representation. Individual policy language and state laws vary, and listeners should rely on guidance from their companies and counsel as appropriate.